She sat in that reading room and watched her husband of 6 years burn a $20 million check, her father's money, while his mistress sat 3 seats away in a red dress, laughing directly into her face. What Derek Whitmore did not know, what nobody in that room knew except one silver-haired attorney and a dead man who had planned every second of this moment from a hospital bed 18 months ago, was that his wife had just become the wealthiest woman in the United States of America. Not from the $20 million check he burned, not from a trust fund, not from savings, not from anything Derek had ever seen, touched, managed, or had his name anywhere near. Claire Whitmore had just inherited a $350 billion estate, a 4,200-acre mansion, a global industrial empire, capital funds, energy companies, and real estate holdings across 4 continents. All of it placed entirely, exclusively, and irrevocably in her name alone, by a father who had spent the last 18 months of his dying life building the most precise, legally airtight, personally devastating trap ever constructed for a man who married his daughter for money, and her husband sat across that table and burned the decoy check while his mistress laughed. He thought he was showing power. He had just signed his own destruction. So ask yourself this: what kind of man brings his mistress to his wife's father's reading? What kind of father spends his final 18 months on earth not fighting his illness, but building a case? And what kind of woman sits beside the husband who betrayed her for 6 years, lets him hold her hand, lets him cook her dinner, lets him walk into that room completely confident, and says absolutely nothing? Because the answer to that last question is the only answer in this entire story that matters. But to understand what happened in that room on Thursday, you first need to understand what happened on a Tuesday morning in late October, 3 days earlier, in a quiet Connecticut kitchen, when the whole world changed and only one person in the house knew it. Claire Whitmore was 36 years old and the kind of beautiful that doesn't announce itself. Not the sharp, sculpted beauty that fills rooms and demands attention, but the quieter kind, dark eyes that held things, a stillness in the way she moved, an unhurried quality to everything she did that made people in her presence feel, without understanding why, that they were in the company of someone who knew something they didn't. She stood 5'6", kept her dark hair simply cut to her shoulders, and wore the same small gold locket every single day, had worn it every day since she was 9 years old, the year her mother, Eleanor Hargrove, died of a heart condition that came without warning on a Wednesday afternoon and took everything with it when it left. The locket held a photograph so small you had to hold it directly under a light to see it properly. Eleanor, young, laughing, caught mid-sentence by whoever held the camera, alive in the way that only photographs of the dead managed to capture. Raymond Hargrove had clasped it around Claire's neck at the funeral, kneeling to her level in his black suit, and said nothing for a long moment. Just held her face in his hands, then stood, took her hand and walked forward. That was Raymond. He never asked you to be okay before you were. He simply held your hand and walked forward with you. She had been raised at Hargrove Hill, the 4,200-acre Virginia estate that Raymond built from absolute nothing, beginning in 1978 with $200, a handshake, and a clarity of commercial vision so precise that the men who competed against him in those early years described the experience, years later, as trying to play chess against someone who had already seen the last 30 moves. Hargrove Industrial Group became the backbone of 3 industries. Hargrove Capital Management held positions in 47 countries. Hargrove Energy Partners controlled pipeline infrastructure across the Gulf Coast that 3 sitting administrations had quietly depended on. Forbes placed Raymond's net worth at $350 billion in their last published estimate, and Raymond, reading it at his desk in the East Library of Hargrove Hill, had reportedly looked up at George Caldwell and said, "They're low." George had smiled. Raymond had turned the page. Claire grew up inside all of that wealth the way fish grow up inside water, not oblivious to it, but not defined by it either, because Raymond had been deliberate about that from the beginning. She attended public school until 8th grade, drove herself to appointments, cooked her own meals through college, and spent her summers working entry-level positions inside Hargrove Industrial under assumed names that Raymond arranged so no one knew whose daughter she was. She learned how money moved, how power operated, how a room full of men in expensive suits could be simultaneously very impressive and very wrong. She learned to read people the way her father read balance sheets, not for what they showed but for what they concealed. Raymond had not raised her to be an heiress. He had raised her to be a Hargrove. There was a significant difference, and by the time she was 30, Claire understood it completely, even if the man she married did not understand her at all. Derek Allen Whitmore was 42 years old, and handsome in the way that empty buildings can look impressive from a distance. Broad-shouldered, silver-templed at the edges, with a smile that arrived at exactly the right moment and eyes that were warm until they thought no one was watching and went flat and calculating in the space between social performances. He had grown up in suburban Ohio, the son of a car dealership owner who died when Derek was 19 and left behind $60,000 in debt, and a lesson Derek had carried ever since, that the appearance of wealth was a tool and tools were meant to be used. He had built himself carefully over 20 years. The right suits, the right clubs, the right vocabulary. He had developed a particular skill identifying women who had access to money and the emotional need for someone to believe in them, and positioning himself as exactly that person. He was not crude about it. He was not even fully conscious of it, the way people are not conscious of breathing. It was simply the architecture of how he moved through the world. He found Claire at a charity auction in Manhattan 6 years ago, but he had not found her by accident. Margaret Hargrove, Raymond's second wife, already installed inside the Hargrove household, already feeding information to people who paid attention to Raymond Hargrove's finances, had tipped Derek off about Claire's $20 million personal trust fund 8 months before that auction. She had mentioned it at a dinner party through a mutual acquaintance with the casualness of someone who mentions the weather, and Derek had gone home that night and spent 4 hours researching Claire Whitmore with the methodical focus of a man planning a renovation. He knew her trust fund balance. He knew her educational background. He knew she volunteered at 2 charities. He knew she attended a specific auction series every year. He positioned himself there on a Friday evening in April, in a room full of people with old money and good manners, wearing a watch he'd borrowed from a friend and a story about a development project in Charleston that sounded more solid than it was. He introduced himself. He asked the right questions. He listened with extraordinary attention. And Claire, who had spent her entire adult life around men who talked about themselves and expected applause, found herself disarmed by a man who seemed genuinely interested in what she thought. They were married 14 months later. Raymond Hargrove attended the wedding, shook Derek's hand, looked him in the eye for exactly 3 seconds and said, "Take care of her." He said it the way you say something you know will not happen. He smiled anyway because Claire was happy, and Raymond had decided in that moment that his daughter's happiness was worth more than his own judgment for now. He gave himself a timeline. He would watch. He would document. He would wait. He had been right to do all 3. It was that Tuesday morning, 3 days after Raymond's death, that the waiting ended for everyone. Claire was making coffee she didn't intend to drink. Standing at the kitchen window looking at the amber oak tree she and her father had planted in the yard 29 years ago, when Derek's voice came through the bedroom wall, with the clarity of something the universe had decided she needed to hear without obstruction. "The will reading is Thursday, Savannah." George Caldwell's office already confirmed the time. A pause, warm, comfortable, the ease of a man in a private space with someone he doesn't perform for. If the old man was half as smart as everyone kept saying he was, it all goes to Claire, which means it all comes to us. Just be patient 2 more days, baby. We're almost there. Claire's hands tightened on the cold mug. Not dramatically, not in the way of someone breaking, in the way of someone arriving at a destination they had been traveling toward for a long time without quite knowing the address. His low laugh came through the wall, intimate, unhurried, the laugh she had not heard directed at her in 3 years. "I know I love you too." She set the mug down on the counter with both hands. She looked at the oak tree. She breathed in once. She breathed out once. She thought of her father's voice, specific and clear as a bell, from a conversation years before she understood why he was saying it. "The most powerful thing you can ever do, Claire Bear, is let a man believe he has already won." She lowered her hands from the mug. She walked to the living room and sat in the armchair by the window, folded her hands in her lap, and waited for Derek to come out of the bedroom and begin his performance. He did not disappoint. He made pasta primavera that evening, her favorite. He lit the candles, poured the Pinot she loved, sat across from her in the warm candlelight with an expression of such precise and practiced tenderness that for 1/2 second, one involuntary, traitorous half-second, Claire felt the ghost of what she had once believed about him. Then it passed, the way a cloud passes over the sun, and everything was clear and cold again. "You need to eat something," he said, covering her hand with his. "You've been running on nothing since Saturday." "I know," she said. "Thank you for this, Derek." "You don't have to thank me." He squeezed her hand. "I'm your husband." She smiled at him across the candlelight. He smiled back. Two people performing a marriage over pasta and Pinot, and the ghost of everything that had already ended. Wednesday passed in the same carefully constructed warmth. He brought her tea in the morning, sat with her on the couch in the afternoon, turned on the classical playlist she loved and kept the fire going and pressed his shoulder against hers, with the domestic ease of a man completely certain that he controlled the outcome of what was coming. He called her sweetheart 4 times. He asked twice whether she wanted him to come to the will reading or give her space. The question was theater. He had already decided he was coming, had already told Savannah the time and address, but he asked it with the particular thoughtfulness of someone auditioning for a role they believe they've already been cast in. "I'd like you there," Claire said. "You're my husband." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Then I'll be there." She touched the locket at her throat and said nothing further. Thursday morning arrived the way consequential mornings always do, quietly, without fanfare, looking exactly like any other morning from the outside while being something else entirely underneath. Claire rose before dawn. She showered, dressed in black, and stood before the mirror for a long moment, her hand resting flat against her sternum where the locket lay. Then she walked out to the car, and she did not look back at the house, and she did not speak on the drive into the city. And Derek, sitting in the driver's seat with his charcoal suit and his confident hands on the wheel, interpreted her silence as grief and was privately glad for it. He did not know that her silence had never been grief. It had been preparation. The offices of Caldwell and Associates occupied the 22nd floor of a glass tower on Park Avenue that was old enough and serious enough to be above the need to impress anyone. The lobby had no art on the walls. The carpet was dark and the wood was walnut, and the air had the particular quality of a place where large, permanent decisions were made on a regular basis, and the furniture had absorbed the weight of all of them. A receptionist led them to the main conference room without small talk, which was appropriate, and the room itself seemed designed for exactly this purpose. Dark paneling, a long walnut table, crystal water glasses that no one would touch, and above the marble fireplace, a large oil portrait of Raymond Hargrove painted 15 years ago. Claire stopped when she saw it. In the portrait, her father was in his mid-60s, harder and lighter at once, wearing the charcoal suit he favored, with that particular expression she had spent her entire life trying to describe to people who'd never been on the receiving end of it. Not smiling exactly, but certain. Certain in the way of a man who has done the work and trusts the outcome. His eyes in the portrait were dark and still and entirely unmoved by whatever they were looking at, which was, at this angle, the entire room. Raymond was watching. Claire held his gaze for 3 seconds, then she took her seat. The room filled in around her. Margaret Hargrove arrived in a dark navy dress and a double strand of pearls that had belonged to her own mother, and that she wore to every formal occasion as a statement of legitimacy she had been making for 14 years. She was 58 years old, attractive in the architectural way of a woman who had maintained herself carefully and at significant expense, with sharp cheekbones and sharp eyes and the particular tension around the mouth of someone who has spent decades managing a performance. She had married Raymond Hargrove when Claire was 22, and she had understood within the first year of that marriage that Raymond tolerated her graciously and loved his daughter infinitely, and that these two facts together defined the precise geometry of her position in the household. She had made her peace with it publicly. Privately, she had spent 14 years looking for leverage, and 2 years ago she had found Derek Whitmore and recognized in him immediately a man with the same orientation as herself, someone who understood that proximity to wealth was only useful if you converted it before the window closed. They had reached an understanding over 3 meetings in the private dining room of a midtown restaurant that Raymond had never visited. Margaret would provide information about the estate structure. Derek would ensure she was taken care of when the inheritance transferred. It was a clean arrangement between two people who understood each other completely and trusted each other not at all. She sat down across from Claire and pressed a dry handkerchief to the corner of one eye. Thomas Hargrove arrived 30 seconds behind his mother, 43 seconds behind schedule, and with the energy of a man who has been rehearsing a number inside his head for so long that the anticipation of it has become its own kind of intoxication. He was 31 years old, Raymond's stepson, educated at schools Raymond paid for, employed for 4 years at Hargrove Industrial in a position Raymond created and staffed around him, given a company car and an expense account, and a last name that carried more weight than anything Thomas himself had generated. He had Raymond's address on his LinkedIn profile and Raymond's money in his savings account, and none of Raymond's character anywhere in the composition of him. He was tall, soft around the middle, with the restless, unfocused energy of someone who has never had to work hard enough for anything to understand what work actually is. He crossed his arms and sat beside his mother, and his knee began to bounce immediately under the table, a tell so consistent that Raymond had once pointed it out to George Caldwell during a meeting and said, very quietly, "Thomas's knee bounces when he's about to ask for something. Watch." George Caldwell arrived last, which was his right, because it was his room. He was 68 years old and silver-haired and built with the particular economy of a man who had never wasted a movement or a word in his life. He had been Raymond Hargrove's personal attorney for 35 years, had watched the empire built from the foundation up, had drafted every agreement, negotiated every acquisition, had sat in rooms with senators and foreign dignitaries and the occasional president on Raymond's behalf, and had never once been the most powerful person in the room and never once needed to be. He loved Raymond Hargrove the way that good attorneys love great clients, with a loyalty that begins as professional and becomes, after 35 years, something closer to devotion. He had spent the last 18 months helping Raymond construct the most comprehensive legal architecture George had ever assembled in his career. And he had done it with the focused pleasure of a craftsman working on the last and most important thing he would ever build. He carried a leather folder of documents that was thicker than anyone in the room expected. He set it on the table without a sound, sat at the head of the table, and looked around the room with the unhurried expression of a man who already knows every word of the story and has been waiting for the audience to sit down. His gaze stopped for exactly one moment on Claire. A small nod, private, almost invisible. She returned it. And then the door opened again, and Savannah Pierce walked in. She was 34 years old, dressed in a deep red that was so precisely inappropriate for a will reading that it could only have been deliberate. She was striking, dark-haired, sharp-featured, with the composed, forward confidence of a woman who had never once in her life allowed herself to appear uncertain, because she had decided at some point that uncertainty was a weakness she could not afford. She had grown up in rural Georgia, the daughter of a woman who cleaned other people's houses, and she had pulled herself out of that geography through sheer, grinding, relentless ambition. A full academic scholarship, a business degree, a string of positions she leveraged upward like stepping stones until she landed at Derek's real estate firm 6 years ago as his executive assistant. She was brilliant, genuinely sharper than Derek in every measurable way, which was precisely why she had never corrected him when he failed to notice it. She had identified Derek Whitmore within 3 weeks of working for him as a man whose ceiling was determined by his wife's floor, and she had begun building accordingly. She was not under any illusions about what she was doing. She was under one illusion only, that she was the smartest person in any room she entered. It was an illusion that would cost her everything. She introduced herself to the room as Derek's assistant with a smile that communicated, with technical deniability, something else entirely, and took the seat beside Derek without asking anyone if it was taken. Claire looked at her. She had seen Savannah twice before, both times at Derek's office, both times introduced as just my assistant with that easy, dismissive phrase that she now understood was the verbal equivalent of hiding something in plain sight. She looked at Savannah the way you look at a word you have seen 100 times and understood today, for the first time, what it actually means. Then she looked away, back to George Caldwell's folder, back to her hands folded on the table, back to the portrait of her father above the fireplace. Raymond's painted eyes looked back at her, certain and still. George Caldwell opened the folder. "Thank you all for being here," he said, removing his reading glasses from his breast pocket and settling them on the bridge of his nose. Raymond Hargrove prepared these instructions over the course of 18 months with considerable specificity, and he asked that I read them without interruption. I expect that request to be honored. He looked up briefly, not at anyone in particular and somehow at everyone. "Shall we begin?" It wasn't a question. He began. The early bequests took 20 minutes. George read them with the measured pace of someone who understood that the architecture of what Raymond had built needed to be experienced in sequence, that the full meaning of the last chapter required everything that came before it to have already landed. He began with the charitable endowments. The Raymond and Eleanor Hargrove Foundation, endowed in perpetuity with $800 million, chartered to fund medical research into the cardiac condition that had taken Eleanor Hargrove at the age of 41. The Hargrove Scholarship Fund, expanded and restructured, providing full 4-year university funding to 500 students annually from households under $30,000 annual income. A list of long-serving Hargrove employees, 15 names, some of whom had worked for Raymond since the early 80s, each of whom received individual bequests ranging from $250,000 to $1.2 million, with personal notes from Raymond that George did not read aloud but would deliver privately. Margaret's handkerchief, which had been performing grief against her dry eyes for the duration, went very still in her lap during the employee bequests. Each name that George read was someone Margaret had discounted or dismissed, or, in 2 cases, actively attempted to have terminated. Raymond had remembered all of it. George turned to the family bequests. "To Margaret Louise Hargrove," he read, and the room tightened without any visible movement, everyone pulling their attention to the same point the way a compass needle swings north. "Raymond Hargrove leaves the following: the Connecticut secondary property and all furnishings therein, independently appraised at $40 million, to be transferred in full title within 60 days of this reading." Margaret's expression did not move. This was the practiced stillness of a woman who had spent 14 years managing her face in Raymond's presence. But something shifted in her eyes, a quick, involuntary recalibration, the microscopic expression of someone who has been expecting more and is rapidly doing the math. Thomas's knee, which had been bouncing since he sat down, went abruptly still. "Additionally," George continued, "Raymond leaves a written statement for Mrs. Hargrove to be delivered privately by this office." I will note for the record only that the statement addresses certain communications that occurred between Mrs. Hargrove and third parties over the past 2 years, and that documentation of those communications has been preserved and is held by this office as part of the estate's legal record. Margaret went the color of old paper. Derek, beside Claire, did not move. But his left hand, resting on the table, pressed flat against the walnut, the micro-gesture of a man who has just received information through the floor, through the vibration of a room, before he's fully processed what it means. Claire felt it. She noticed everything. She had been noticing everything since Tuesday morning. "To Thomas Raymond Hargrove," George continued, and Thomas sat forward with the momentum of a man who has been waiting for his name. "Raymond leaves the Hargrove Classic Automobile Collection, 18 vehicles, collectively appraised at $18 million, and a cash bequest of $5 million. Thomas did not move for a full 3 seconds. Then, "That's it." His voice came out thinner than he intended. The words hit the air of the conference room and landed badly, revealing in their flatness the exact shape and size of what Thomas had been expecting, which was considerably more. "Thomas." Margaret's hand went to his arm. There has to be, he told me, Thomas." Her voice had no comfort in it. It was a warning. He fell silent. His knee began bouncing again. Faster this time. George did not look up from the folder. He simply turned the page with the patience of a man who expected this and allocated no additional time for it. "I will note," he said without emphasis, "that Mr. Hargrove anticipated responses to these bequests and prepared written statements for each recipient. Those statements will be delivered privately. They are not part of the public record of this reading." He turned another page. Derek Allen Whitmore. The room went a different kind of still. The earlier silences had been stunned, the silence of people recalibrating against numbers. This was something else. This was the silence before the thing everyone has been building toward, and everyone in the room felt it differently. Margaret felt it as dread. Thomas felt it as confusion. Savannah felt it as arrival, as the moment she had been patient for. She sat slightly forward in her chair, almost imperceptibly, the way someone leans toward the stage when the performance reaches its highest point. Derek's hands pressed flat on the table, steady, controlled, the picture of a man bracing for impact of the best and most deserved kind. Claire looked at the portrait above the fireplace. George removed his reading glasses, set them on the table, picked up a separate sheet of paper, heavier stock, clearly different from the legal documents in the folder. He said, "Raymond Hargrove prepared a personal statement for Mr. Whitmore to be read aloud in full, in the presence of all parties as a matter of record. I will read it now." He read it. His voice was level and unhurried and gave every word exactly as much weight as Raymond had placed into it. "Derek, you arrived in my daughter's life with the right words and the wrong intentions. You researched her before you introduced yourself. You used her trust, her name, her kindness, and her time. You drained the account she did not know you had access to, 4 years of forged authorization signatures on joint investment forms, documented in full. You brought another woman into my family's professional orbit and called her an assistant. You made my daughter doubt herself in rooms where she was the most remarkable person present. I watched you for 6 years. I documented everything. What follows is my formal assessment of everything you attempted to take from my daughter and what it is worth to me." George set the statement down. He reached into the folder and produced a sealed envelope with Derek's name on the front in Raymond's handwriting. He slid it across the walnut table. Derek's hands reached for it. His fingers were not entirely steady. He tore it open. He pulled out the contents, a check, $20 million. Made out to Derek Allen Whitmore in the correct legal form, signed by Raymond Hargrove, dated and notarized, with a single word written across its face in red ink, in large, clear, unmistakable letters that took up the entire check, void. Derek stared at it. The silence lasted 4 full seconds, 4 seconds that contained multitudes, that aged Derek Whitmore visibly, that stripped the last of the performed composure from his face, and left something underneath that was neither handsome nor impressive. Then George reached into the folder one final time and produced a small silver lighter. He set it on the table in front of the check. Gently, with 2 fingers, the way you place something that has been placed in your care by someone who is no longer there to place it themselves. Mr. Hargrove's explicit instruction, George said, was that you be given the choice to burn it yourself. He asked me to convey his exact words, which were. He picked up the statement again and read the final line with the same unhurried precision as everything else. Let him feel what it is to watch something valuable turn to nothing. That is what he gave my daughter for 6 years. The room held itself, and then Savannah Pierce laughed. It was not a polite laugh, not the uncomfortable, socially managed exhale of someone processing something awkward in a high-pressure room. It was a real laugh, bright, sharp, genuine, and completely cruel, the laugh of a woman who had forgotten in one catastrophic second that she was sitting inside a room full of permanent consequences. It rose out of her without calculation, which made it the most honest thing Savannah Pierce had done since she walked through the door, and also the single worst mistake of her life. She was looking directly at Claire when she laughed. Eye contact. Held. The deliberate, unflinching eye contact of a woman communicating something she had wanted to communicate for a long time. Your father humiliated your husband in front of lawyers, and he is still going to walk out of this room with me. And there is nothing in the world you can do about any of it. Claire looked back at her. Those dark, quiet eyes. The eyes that had been watching since Tuesday morning. The eyes that had watched Derek cook pasta and pour wine, and press his shoulder against hers on the couch for 2 days while she held the knowledge of what he was like a smooth stone in a closed fist. Those eyes held Savannah's gaze with a steadiness that, if Savannah had been paying better attention, if she had been any fraction of the observer she believed herself to be, would have stopped the laugh in her throat before it started. She was not paying better attention. Derek picked up the lighter. His hand was shaking. Not slightly, genuinely shaking. The tremor of a man who is furious and humiliated and has understood, in the past 60 seconds, that he has been seen completely by a man he spent 6 years dismissing as a sentimental old billionaire too attached to his daughter to see clearly. Raymond had seen clearly. Raymond had seen everything. Derek's hand shook as he struck the lighter wheel, and the small flame appeared, and he touched it to the bottom corner of the voided check. He watched it burn. He watched $20 million, the decoy, the theatrical gesture, the elaborate prop Raymond had constructed to give Derek the choice between 2 kinds of public humiliation, turned to ash in a crystal dish on the credenza. He dropped it before it reached his fingers. He stood there looking at the ash with the expression of a man who has just understood, too late, the geometry of what he walked into. The burning was not about the money. Raymond had known Derek would burn it, had designed the moment so that not burning it would mean accepting the humiliation as a gift, which Derek's pride would never allow. The burning was the documentation. George Caldwell, in his role as witness and legal officer of the estate, had just watched Derek Whitmore publicly destroy a financial instrument bearing Raymond Hargrove's signature while in the presence of the estate's primary beneficiary. It was theater, yes. It was also a permanent legal record of Derek's character, performed voluntarily in front of witnesses at Raymond's invitation. Even in this, Raymond had been 3 steps ahead. Derek sat down. He put both hands flat on the table. He stared at the ash. Margaret had not moved since George read the line about documented communications. She sat with her pearls and her dry handkerchief and her face perfectly arranged. But there was something happening behind her eyes that looked like a structure collapsing slowly, floor by floor, in the controlled way that tall buildings are demolished, deliberately, sequentially, and without the possibility of reversal. Thomas had stopped asking questions. He sat with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, and looked at the corner of the room the way people look at corners when they are trying to hold themselves together and have nowhere else to look. Savannah had stopped laughing. The laugh had died in her throat sometime during the burning, had been replaced by something she didn't have a name for yet, though it bore a resemblance to the first cold awareness that the room you are standing in is not the room you thought it was. George Caldwell waited for the ash to stop moving. Then he picked up his reading glasses. He put them back on. He looked down at the folder and turned to the final page with the calm, deliberate movement of someone who has been waiting for this moment for 18 months and intends to give it exactly the weight it deserves. "And now," he said, and his voice was different, not louder, not more dramatic, but grounded in something deeper, the voice of a man arriving at the sentence he was always going to arrive at. "For Claire Whitmore, née Hargrove." The room stopped breathing. Derek's head came up. Margaret's hand tightened on her handkerchief. Thomas uncrossed his arms. Savannah went very still, and Raymond Hargrove watched from his portrait above the fireplace, certain and unhurried and entirely at peace with what was about to happen. George Reed. His voice filled the room like water fills a vessel completely, reaching every corner. "To Claire Whitmore, née Hargrove, I leave the entirety of the Hargrove estate, to be held in her name alone in perpetuity, including but not limited to Hargrove Hill Mansion and its surrounding 4,200 acres in Buckingham County, Virginia. Full majority ownership of Hargrove Industrial Group, Hargrove Capital Management, Hargrove Energy Partners, all domestic and international real estate holdings across 14 countries, all private equity stakes. The complete art and artifacts collection, all personal and offshore accounts, and all remaining assets in the Hargrove Family Trust. Total estimated combined valuation as of the date of this reading." George paused, not for effect, because Raymond had instructed him to pause here, had written the word pause in the margin of his own document, wanting even this final beat to be precise. George looked up. He looked at Claire. He said it clearly, without inflation or emphasis, in the flat declarative voice of a man stating a fact. $350 billion. No one moved. The number sat in the room the way a struck bell sits in the air, present and reverberating and impossible to unhear, the sound continuing long after the moment that produced it. Derek stood up so abruptly his chair screamed across the floor. That can't. He couldn't form a complete sentence. His jaw worked. His hands, which had been flat on the table, were now gripping the edge of it. She only had a 20 million, the trust fund was 20. The trust fund was a separate legal instrument established when Claire turned 25, George said, with the patience of a man who prepared for this question 18 months ago and has been waiting to answer it. The estate is an entirely different architecture. Mr. Hargrove maintained these structures deliberately, for legal and personal reasons documented thoroughly in the supplemental materials. The two instruments have never been connected on paper. Thomas slammed both palms on the table. The water glasses rattled. This is fabricated. He had a family. He had a son who worked for him for 4 years, who carried his name. "You are not his son," George said, and his voice did not rise, but acquired an edge so fine and so clean that the room felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure. "You are his stepson. That distinction is made clearly, repeatedly, and with considerable precision throughout these documents, and I would strongly encourage you to review those documents with your own counsel before making further claims in this room, Thomas. Sit down." Thomas sat down. Margaret rose. "She is not even his, Mrs. Hargrove." George looked at her over the rim of his glasses with an expression that contained something ancient and immovable. "Whatever you are about to allege, and I believe I know precisely what it is, there is a sealed affidavit in this folder that Raymond prepared specifically in response to that allegation. He anticipated it with considerable accuracy. I will tell you only this. If you complete that sentence in this room today, it will be the most expensive sentence you have ever spoken. Raymond's documentation is thorough, it is witnessed, and it is devastating. Do you understand me?" Margaret sat down. Her hands were shaking, real shaking, not the performance of grief she had been running since she arrived. Real, involuntary, structural shaking. The tremor of someone who has just understood that the building they have been standing in for 2 years has been on controlled demolition timers from the beginning. Derek turned to Claire. His face had gone through white, through red, through something beyond either of those, through the complete dissolution of the architecture of confidence he had maintained for 6 years, and arrived at something raw and reaching and desperate. He crossed to her side of the table. He said her name like a question, like an appeal, like a man grabbing at the edge of something he can feel sliding away beneath him. "Claire, sweetheart, listen to me. This doesn't have to change anything between us. This is a good thing. We'll talk about this. We can figure out what this means together. I am listening, she said. Her voice was exactly the same as it always was. The same register, the same unhurried quietness. She might have been discussing the weather. She might have been discussing anything at all. There was nothing in it that sounded like anger because it wasn't anger. It was something much colder and much more permanent than anger. Derek reached for her arm. Not violently, with the grip of a man who has understood in full the complete dimensions of what he is losing and whose body has reacted before his reason caught up. Claire, please, 6 years. You can't just 6 years means something you can't just walk away from. I'm not walking away from 6 years, she said, soft, still, completely unmoved. I'm walking away from Tuesday morning, when you told Savannah to be patient. Color left Derek's face so completely and so instantly that for a moment he looked like the painted version of himself rather than the man, a portrait of a man, drained of all the performance that had been holding the image together. She heard. She had known since Tuesday morning. She had sat beside him on the couch. Let him hold her hand. Let him cook dinner and light candles and press his shoulder against hers and call her sweetheart for 2 days, knowing everything, holding it, waiting. She had let him walk into this room confident and perform his grief and his patience and his love in front of George Caldwell and a legal notary in the corner with a recording device. And she had said nothing, done nothing, shown nothing. She had let Raymond's trap close around him at exactly the speed Raymond designed it to close. Derek's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Claire stood, smoothed her black dress with both hands, and turned toward the door. That was when Savannah Pierce made the last decision of her current life. She stood, and she said it clearly, loudly, for the whole room, for George Caldwell, for the notary, for Thomas and Margaret, for the air and the walls and the portrait of Raymond Hargrove watching from above the fireplace. You think you've won something, honey. He was never yours, not for a single day of your marriage. He was mine the whole time you were playing house. The whole time you were being the good little wife, he was with me. You never had him. Not once. Claire stopped. She stood with one hand resting on the back of her chair, and she took one breath, one quiet, complete breath. And when she turned, she looked at Savannah Pierce with an expression so devoid of performance, so completely and utterly unmoved, that something in Savannah's chest went cold without her understanding why. No rage. No tears. No trembling lip or burning eyes. Just those dark, quiet, fathomless eyes, resting on Savannah the way deep water rests on the things it covers. Right, Claire said. Her voice was almost gentle. He was never mine. She looked at Derek, one full, clear, final look, the look of someone seeing something exactly as it is for the first time and finding at the end of it that they are not surprised. Then back to Savannah. And now neither is anything he thinks he still has. She walked out. The door closed behind her. It made the softest sound in the world, barely audible. The sound a door makes when the person closing it has no anger left, no performance left, nothing left to prove to the room or anyone in it, just a direction to walk and the clarity to walk in it. Raymond Hargrove watched from his portrait. He looked, if a painted man can look anything, satisfied. The news broke before Claire reached Virginia. It took less than 3 hours. Someone in the building talked. A paralegal, a receptionist, someone standing close enough to a conference room door on the 22nd floor of a Park Avenue office tower to hear a number that the human brain is not built to keep secret. By 4 o'clock that Thursday afternoon, it was on every financial wire service in the country. By 6, it had migrated from the finance pages to the front pages. By 8, it was the banner headline on every major network, sitting above photographs of Claire that had been pulled from charity event archives and foundation galas, photographs in which she appeared exactly as she always appeared, composed and dark-eyed, and somehow set apart from the noise around her, as though she had always known something the room hadn't caught up to yet. CLAIRE WHITMOR, INHRITS $350 billion, BCOMES wealthiest American overnight RYMOND, HARGROVE shocking will. Everything to his daughter, nothing to his wife WHO is CLAR, WHITMOR. Inside the life of America's new RICHEST woman presidents called George Caldwell's office before the evening was out. 2 senators left voicemails. A representative from a foreign trade delegation emailed at 11:15 at night with a subject line that read, "Partnership opportunity, urgent," in 3 languages. George's assistant, a woman named Patricia who had worked for the firm for 22 years and had the organizational instincts of a military general, sorted everything into a folder she labeled "Later, Claire's instruction required," and forwarded nothing. Claire was already on the road to Virginia when the headlines began. She drove herself, as she always had no driver, no security yet, just the dark 4-lane highway south and the radio off, and the silence of a woman who had been performing composure for 3 days and could finally stop performing it because there was no one in the car to perform it for. She cried for exactly 40 minutes. Not the unraveling kind of crying, not the desperate, gasping grief of someone losing control, but the deep, sustained, full-body release of a person who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has finally been given permission to put it down. She cried for her father. She cried for the marriage she had believed in. She cried for the version of herself that had sat across a candle-lit table from a man who was stealing from her and called it a good evening. She cried until there was nothing left to cry, and then she wiped her face with the back of her hand and drove the remaining 2 hours in a silence that felt, for the first time in days, completely clean. Meanwhile, in a glass and steel apartment on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, Derek Whitmore was on the phone. He had been on the phone since the car ride back from Caldwell and Associates, working through his contacts with the focused, slightly feverish energy of a man who has identified a problem and is applying every tool he has to it before the window closes. He reached James Forster, one of the 3 most aggressive matrimonial attorneys in New York, by 7 o'clock. Forster listened without interrupting, asked 4 precise questions, and then said, in the measured voice of a man calibrating risk against reward in real time, "You have a spousal contribution argument. 6 years of documented partnership, professional support, emotional investment. A court could consider that in the context of a marital estate. It's not a certainty." "But it's not nothing." Derek asked how long it would take. Forster said, "We file for emergency injunction Monday morning. We argue that no assets from the Hargrove estate can be transferred, liquidated, or restructured until the marital claim is evaluated. That buys us time." Derek said, "Do it." He hung up and stood at his floor-to-ceiling window looking out at the lit geometry of Manhattan and told himself the story that men like Derek always tell themselves in moments like this. That he was the one who had been wronged, that 6 years was 6 years, that whatever Raymond Hargrove had built and documented and destroyed in that conference room today, he was owed something. He told himself this story with the conviction of someone who has been telling versions of it his whole life and has never yet been held accountable for the gap between the story and the truth. 2 floors below him, in the apartment he paid for but whose lease was in neither of their names, Savannah Pierce was on her own phone. She had called Marcus Lee, a journalist at a tabloid who owed her a favor from a story she'd fed him 2 years ago about a competitor of Derek's, and she was building a narrative with the same methodical intelligence she applied to everything, repurposing it now in the direction of survival. "I have a story," she told him. "The real story behind the Hargrove inheritance. The wife nobody's talking about who couldn't keep her husband. The mistress who was there first and stayed longest. The cold, absent heiress who was so wrapped up in daddy's money she never noticed her marriage falling apart." Marcus said, "Can you be exclusive?" Savannah said. "For the right number, I can be anything you need." She hung up and sat on the edge of her bed in the red dress she hadn't changed out of, and she felt in that moment that she was seizing control of a narrative that had temporarily slipped sideways. She did not feel afraid. She had not yet understood that the narrative she was about to hand to a journalist was going to be used against her in ways she could not yet imagine, by a dead man who had anticipated this phone call from a hospital bed in Virginia 18 months ago and prepared accordingly. Back at Hargrove Hill, Thomas and Margaret were in the Connecticut estate's formal sitting room, with a bottle of Raymond's whiskey open between them and a lawyer on speakerphone. Their attorney, a will contest specialist named Gerald Park, who charged $800 an hour and had the courtroom temperament of a man who had won ugly cases before and was not squeamish about it, was walking them through their options. "Testamentary incapacity is your strongest avenue," he said. "We argue that Raymond Hargrove was not of sound mind in the final 18 months when these documents were prepared. We subpoena medical records. We retain a forensic psychiatrist. We look for evidence of undue influence. Specifically, we build the case that Claire manipulated her access to Raymond during his illness to secure a preferential bequest." Margaret said. "How long?" Gerald said. 18 months to 2 years before a ruling, assuming they fight it, and they will fight it." Thomas said. "We fight." Margaret refilled both glasses. Her hand was steadier now than it had been in the conference room. She had recovered her composure, which had always been her most reliable asset, and she was channeling everything back through it. She did not tell Gerald Park about the conversations with Derek. She did not mention the 2 years of information she had fed him about the estate structure. She would deal with that separately. She was good at dealing with things separately. She had been doing it for 14 years. Outside, the October night pressed against the windows of every room where these people sat making their plans, and Raymond Hargrove's name scrolled across screens from coast to coast, and $350 billion sat in Claire's name like a fact about the universe. Unmovable, permanent, entirely indifferent to the panic of the people building legal strategies around it. And right now, if you are watching this and your blood is boiling, if you can feel the rage of watching these people scheme and strategize and try to dismantle what a dying man built for his daughter, if Savannah's red dress and Derek's phone calls and Margaret's whiskey glass are making your jaw clench, then you already know what kind of story this is. Subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button, because what Claire finds when she walks into Hargrove Hill will change every single thing. What her father left inside that safe is not just money. It is the complete, documented, legally devastating truth about every single person in this story, and Claire is about to open it. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you are watching from. We want to know, because this story is everywhere, and part 2 is coming, and you do not want to miss what happens next. Claire pulled through the iron gates of Hargrove Hill at 11:47 at night. The estate lights came on automatically as her headlights swept the long gravel drive, the security system recognizing the car, the grounds illuminating themselves in sequence, the 4,200-acre estate announcing itself in the darkness the way things that have always been yours announce themselves when you finally come home. She parked and sat for a moment with the engine off, looking at the house. It was enormous in the way that homes built by people with absolute conviction are enormous, not ostentatious, not performing, simply as large as the life that had been lived inside it demanded. Limestone facade, black shuttered windows, the east wing where the library was, the piano room. The study on the 3rd floor with the Remington painting on the wall that she had not thought about in 12 years, and was thinking about now with a specificity that surprised her. The exact painting, the exact wall, the exact height at which it hung, the way the subconscious surfaces things it has been holding in reserve, waiting for the moment when you are finally ready to need them. She got out of the car. She walked to the front door. She put her hand on the door, and the door opened, and she walked into her father's house and stood in the entrance hall and looked up at the chandelier her mother had chosen in 1987, and she said, out loud, to the empty room, to the house that had been waiting for her for 12 years, to her father who was everywhere in it and nowhere in it, "Home, Dad." The house held the words. She walked toward the staircase. The East Library smelled exactly as she remembered. Old paper and cedar, and the specific quality of air that accumulates in a room where someone has spent decades thinking carefully. Raymond's chair was still at its angle by the window, the high-backed leather chair he'd had since before Claire was born, worn to the precise shape of him. The armrests darkened where his hands had rested through 30 years of reading and planning, and the quiet, continuous work of a mind that never fully stopped moving. His reading glasses were folded on the side table. His last book was still open, face down, preserving the page he'd been on. Claire walked to it and looked at the spine without touching it. She picked it up. Marcus Aurelius. She almost smiled. Of course. She set it back exactly as it had been. She walked through the library into the piano room. The Baldwin upright sat against the far wall, lit by the ambient glow of the estate grounds coming through the tall windows. She had not touched this piano in 12 years, had left it here when she married Derek, left it in her father's house in the care of his staff, who kept it tuned without being asked because that was the kind of household Raymond ran, where things that mattered were maintained as a matter of course. She sat on the bench. She placed her hands on the keys. She played 4 bars of the piece she had been playing for her father on those Saturday visits, a Chopin nocturne, the one in B-flat minor, slow and searching and built around a kind of grief that resolves, eventually, into something else. Something that isn't quite peace but is adjacent to it. She played 4 bars and stopped. She sat in the silence after the notes. Then she touched the locket. It had been at her throat all day, through the will reading, through Derek's grip on her arm, through Savannah's laugh and the burning check and the drive south through the dark. She had touched it 100 times today the way you touch something you are not yet ready to open. Now she reached up and unclasped it and held it in her palm and looked at it under the piano room light. The small gold oval, her mother's photograph inside. And behind the photograph, she knew this now with a certainty she could not entirely explain, the certainty of someone who has heard the right sentence and felt the tumblers of a lock, a line, a key. Her father had said it to her once, years ago, in this room. She had been 16. She had asked him why he always wore his own watch on his right wrist instead of his left, and he'd said, without looking up from the document he was reviewing, because the things that matter most are the ones you keep where they're unexpected, Claire Bear. The obvious place is the first place someone looks. She had filed it away without understanding it, the way you file things a parent says that don't make sense until they do. She understood it now, completely, irreversibly. She pressed the tiny hinge at the back of the locket, and it opened differently than it had ever opened before, the photograph panel releasing forward, and behind it, set into the gold backing with the precision of something custom-made, a key no larger than her thumbnail. Flat, silver, with 3-notched teeth and a small engraved mark on its head that she had to hold directly under the light to read 3 floor. She climbed the stairs. The 3rd floor of Hargrove Hill was quieter than the rest of the house, a long corridor with dark wood floors and the kind of hush that corridors acquire when the person who used them most is gone. Raymond's study was at the end of the hall. She had been in this room perhaps a dozen times in her life, always invited, always preceded by a knock. She pushed the door open now and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at it, his desk, his chair, the bookshelves that lined 3 walls from floor to ceiling. And on the 4th wall, above the fireplace, the Frederick Remington oil painting, a cavalry scene in ochre and shadow, horses mid-stride, a landscape of movement and dust, that Raymond had purchased at auction in 1994 for a sum that had seemed extraordinary at the time, and was now a footnote in the context of what he owned. She had always found the painting slightly too energetic for the quiet study. She understood now that its placement had never been about aesthetics. She crossed to the fireplace. She lifted the painting from its hook with both hands, heavier than she expected, the canvas substantial in its gilt frame, and leaned it carefully against the base of the bookshelf. Behind it, set flush into the plaster wall so seamlessly that you would have to know it was there to find it, was a safe. Small, gunmetal gray, 8 inches square with a single keyhole at its center. She put the key in. She turned it. The safe opened with the soft, definitive click of something that has been waiting an appropriate amount of time. Inside were 5 accordion folders, each one full and fat with documentation, each one labeled in Raymond's handwriting with the same dark ink and the same clear, unembellished print that she had been reading in legal documents all day. DREK, financial fraud. DREK and Savannah, account records. MARGARET, COMMUNICATONS with DREK. Thomas Medical Interference ATTMPTS. Supplemental for George Caldwell's Izan beneath the folders, one envelope. Her name on it, Raymond's handwriting. No other markings. She sat on the floor of the study. She opened the envelope first. She unfolded 3 pages of her father's handwriting and she read every word without stopping. And as she read, the full architecture of the past 2 years assembled itself around her in complete, devastating, documented detail. Raymond had known about Derek's access to her trust fund accounts for 4 years. He had first noticed the discrepancy during a routine review of Claire's financial position that he conducted, without her knowledge, every year since she turned 25, not because he distrusted her, but because he was Raymond Hargrove and reviewing the financial positions of the people he loved was as natural to him as breathing. He had flagged the pattern to George Caldwell in year 1. In year 2, he obtained a court-authorized warrant through a private legal channel, the kind of channel available only to people with both resources and relationships, and installed a recording device on the Connecticut house's landline, capturing 2 years of communications between Margaret and Derek that documented their arrangement with a completeness that would have made federal prosecutors envious. In year 3, he hired a forensic accountant who spent 11 months reconstructing every transaction in which Derek had forged Claire's signature on joint investment authorization forms, pulling money from her trust into his failing development company through a series of transfers designed to look like agreed investment decisions. The total amount extracted across 4 years was $8.3 million. The forensic accountant's report was in the first folder, 212 pages, tabbed and annotated in Raymond's hand. In year 4, the last year, the sick year, Raymond had learned about Savannah's role not just as Derek's mistress, but as co-signatory on 3 of the accounts through which the forged transfers had moved, making her legally complicit in the fraud. That documentation was in the second folder. The third folder, Margaret's, contained transcripts of 47 phone calls and 11 in-person meetings between Margaret and Derek, recorded over 22 months, in which Margaret had systematically provided Derek with proprietary information about the estate structure, Raymond's health, the anticipated timeline of the inheritance, and the specific legal architecture of Claire's trust fund. In 3 of the recordings, Margaret had used words that a criminal attorney would describe, without hesitation, as conspiracy. The 4th folder, Thomas, was the thinnest, but in some ways the most brutal. Raymond's private investigator had documented 2 separate attempts by Thomas to contact Raymond's medical team at the Virginia hospital with the stated goal of obtaining records that could support a legal finding of mental incompetence. In the second attempt, Thomas had offered a financial inducement to a member of Raymond's care staff, an inducement that had been refused, reported to the hospital's legal office, and documented in a way that the hospital attorney had advised was potentially criminal. Raymond had the original report. He had copies of the communications. He had an affidavit from the staff member who refused. The letter ended, "When they come for you, and they will, my darling, because I know exactly who they are, remember what I always told you. A Hargrove never draws first. We watch and we wait and we build, and then we let them watch what happens. The key in your locket opens the private safe behind the Remington painting, 3rd floor. Inside you will find everything I have spent the last 18 months collecting, every recording, every document, every forgery, every email, every phone record, every account statement. I had one job left to do for you and I did it. I love you infinitely. Dad." Claire folded the letter. She pressed it against her chest with both hands. She sat on the floor of her father's study, surrounded by 5 folders of documented truth, and she held the letter against her sternum where the open locket lay, and she stayed like that for a long time in the silence that only very large, very old houses produce. A silence that felt inhabited rather than empty, the silence of a place that holds the memory of someone the way water holds the shape of something that moved through it. When she stood, her eyes were dry. Her jaw was set. She looked around the room, the desk, the shelves, the painting leaning against the bookcase, the open safe, and she looked like what she was. Not an heiress, not a widow, not a woman wronged. A Hargrove. Completely and finally a Hargrove standing in the room her father built, holding the evidence he assembled, ready to finish what he started. She picked up her phone and called George Caldwell. He answered on the first ring, as though he had been sitting with the phone in his hand, waiting. The way you wait when you have sent someone to find something and you know exactly when they will find it. "George," she said, "I found the safe." "I know, Claire, your father told me you would." Gave me 5 folders. "George," she paused, not from uncertainty, from the particular stillness of someone who is about to begin something irreversible and wants to feel the full weight of the decision before they make it. "Is all of this enough?" George Caldwell was quiet for exactly 1 second. "Claire," he said, "by the time we are finished, Derek Whitmore will not have a bank account. Savannah Pierce will not have a professional license. Margaret Hargrove will not have the Connecticut estate. And Thomas," he paused. The pause was different from Raymond's instructed pause in the will reading. This one was personal. The pause of a man who has been carrying something for 18 months and is finally close enough to the destination to feel the relief of it. Thomas is going to learn something that was in your father's sealed affidavit, something none of them expected, something that changes everything about this family story one final time. Claire looked at the Remington painting leaning against the bookcase. The cavalry horses frozen mid-stride. All that movement arrested in oil and canvas, suspended on the edge of a consequence. "What is it?" she asked. George said, "That is for part 2. She stood at her father's desk. She put one hand flat on the surface of it. She felt the wood under her palm, old and solid, and saturated with 30 years of the most important decisions she had ever been adjacent to. Outside the study window, the Hargrove Hill grounds stretched 4,200 acres into the Virginia night, lit softly by the estate lamps, hers in every legal and permanent and documented sense of the word, she said. "Then let's get started," George said. "I'll have the first filing ready by Monday morning." She hung up. She stood in the silence of the study for one more moment. Then she looked up at the wall where the Remington had hung, at the square of slightly lighter plaster, where the painting had protected the wall from years of light. And she thought about her father in this room, in that chair, behind this desk, building the case that would outlast him, planning it from a hospital bed, dictating documents with a precision that had not diminished 1 degree under the weight of dying. Loving her specifically and completely in the only language Raymond Hargrove had ever fully trusted, the language of preparation, of documentation, of making sure, beyond every possible legal challenge, that the people who came for his daughter would find her not unprepared and not alone, but standing on ground he had spent 18 months reinforcing beneath her feet. She picked up the 5 folders. She carried them to the desk. She sat in her father's chair. And Claire Whitmore, née Hargrove, the wealthiest woman in the United States of America, the daughter of a titan, the wife of a fraud, and the instrument of a reckoning that was only just beginning, opened the first folder and got to work. End of Part 1, High Voltage Part 2 teaser. The machine turns on. Derek's attorneys will file Monday morning and find that every legal motion they draft has already been anticipated, answered, and neutralized, not by Claire's team, but by Raymond Hargrove, from a hospital room in Virginia, 18 months ago, dictating countermeasures to George Caldwell with the systematic precision of a man who understood that the best revenge is one the other person walks into believing it was their own idea. Savannah's tabloid interview will be published Tuesday. By Wednesday, the journalist who ran it will be served with a subpoena. By Thursday, Savannah herself will understand that every word she gave to Marcus Lee has just become evidence in a federal fraud investigation that has her name on it in 3 separate documents she did not know existed. Margaret will receive Raymond's private letter by certified mail on Friday. What is in that letter will not be shared with Thomas. It will not be shared with Derek. It will be read by Margaret alone in the Connecticut estate that Raymond left her. And when she finishes reading it, she will sit for a very long time in a room that she has just understood does not entirely belong to her, and she will make a phone call that no one will see coming. And Thomas will be in George Caldwell's office on the following Monday, with his attorney, ready to file the will contest, ready to begin the argument about testamentary incapacity, when George opens a folder and places a document on the table in front of him. A document from the sealed affidavit. A document about Thomas's parentage that Raymond spent 2 years verifying through private channels before he put it in writing. A document that does not just affect the will contest. A document that affects everything Thomas Hargrove believes about his own identity, his own history, his own name. And Claire will be watching, not performing, not reacting, not drawing first, just watching and waiting and letting her father finish what he started. Part 2 is coming, and it will be the most devastating thing you have ever watched.